Okay, so the thing we've got to cover right now is something really brief, but we definitely do need to touch on it. These are things called the four angles of interpretation. Okay, these four angles of interpretation, of analysis, four lenses of analysis, however you want to think about it, these are four different ways that you can look at a story, and a lot of times considering them through these different ways will show how many different possible layers there are to interpretation, how many different angles and just methodologies that you can use to try to see what's really going on in a story. So, the first one we've got is called new criticism. New criticism. New criticism is in many ways both a simple and an incredibly complicated thing to do. New criticism involves really, truly, and totally only looking at the text or the art itself with nothing else. Okay? So you don't think about the author, you don't think about what year it was written, you don't even think about the book design or the font selection, any of these sort of stuff. You just read the text itself. So think back on all the different stories that we've read, the things where maybe you knew a little bit about the author, the things where you knew what year it was written, or any of that sort of stuff. In new criticism, you disregard all of that. All you have is the words on the page, and you come to your judgments using strictly that. Okay? So that's one of the four angles. The next one is authorial intent. In authorial intent, what the writer or artist intended is paramount. In this school, it's really kind of interesting because you definitely want to think about what was the author actually trying to do. And in many cases, you actually sort of like go back and find out what the author thought about the story. For a lot of them, we've come up with various interpretations. Did the author actually mean that? Okay, so this is something that's really interesting in light of sort of crazy interpretations. For example, if there are black boots in a story, do you say, if you come up with the interpretation that that's a commentary on our mortality, did the author actually mean that? Or is that just something that we're sort of making up? So there's a lot of debate about this, and the way to do it, people who are interested in authorial intent, a lot of times they go back, they read commentary by the authors, they read interviews with the authors, they try to find out what the author was actually meaning. Here's the key thing, though. In a sense, according to a new critical perspective, what the author's intention is doesn't really matter. Okay, so say, for example, an author says, oh, I wanted you to try to get this from it, but if you got that, that's wrong. To a certain extent, who cares what the author thinks? The author might not even be alive anymore. Maybe we're coming up with something different. Maybe there's something there that the author didn't necessarily mean. Okay, so see, authorial intent can be really helpful, but it can also be problematic. Just like, for instance, new criticism can be really helpful and interesting, but also sometimes you might need a little bit of help from outside things to assist you in your analysis. Okay? The third way of looking, or angle of analysis, is contextual. Contextual. In contextual analysis, you take into account every surrounding element of the author or artist's circumstance or the historical situation in which the writing was happening. Okay, so that means if you read a story and it took place in 1948, you maybe are going to interpret that story differently than if the story was written in, 1995. So these types of things. If the story was written in sub-Saharan Africa, it might make you look at it a little bit differently versus whether it was written in England or Alabama. Okay, so this contextual environment is the type of thing that can be really helpful in giving a little bit more depth and analysis. But of course, just like with the other models, it has its problems. So for example, sometimes it can place more emphasis on the good story of the writer or the writer's circumstance or the historical context than it does on whether the writer actually wrote a good story. For example, a blind 8-year-old with oppressive parents in a tyrannical sub-Saharan regime paints a picture representing her life. Okay, the art world may praise this painting, but is it actually a good painting? Or were they just romanced by the dynamism of its circumstance? This viewpoint does tend to be derided by those in control because few wealthy people have the type of woe is me story contextual fans love. So, in some ways, contextual is really good, but sometimes people can use the context of a piece of art to actually uplift it when the art itself isn't that great. Okay, so that's the third way. So, the fourth way of looking things is reader response. Okay, and in a sense, it's reader or viewer response, because these four angles apply to all types of art. Not simply literature, but they also count for things like sculpture, things like painting, things like movies, for example. If you're watching a movie, you can watch just the movie itself, or maybe the movie was written under a certain context, or maybe you want to look at the director's commentary to see what he or she meant. So, this fourth one, reader/viewer response. This is the most free-ranging way of looking at things, because this is the one where what the reader feels or what the viewer feels is the most important element. It sometimes audaciously goes even as far as to say the art doesn't even exist until someone reads it, and that the reader is complicit in the effort of making a text what it is. In truth, many authors and artists kind of hate this viewpoint because it gives privilege to the reader to just walk in and say whatever he or she thinks and feeling justified in that, even if that viewer or reader doesn't really know what he or she is talking about. Reader response, because it wholeheartedly accepts the bias and experience of the reader, can result in someone saying that, for example, somebody like Justin Bieber is better than Beethoven. This very well may be true, but also maybe the person coming up with that opinion has sort of a shortage of knowledge about the subject. So, in any way, being a reader response critic means that however you react to the story or the poem or the painting does carry a lot of weight, but remember, that's just one of the four angles, and the other four are things you want to take into account as well. So, here's the thing. Obviously, the best criticism you can have is one that tries to work all four of these angles in turn as a type of mental exercise. Okay? And via this, you can make an effort to paint a complete picture of the story or poem or artwork's value. Of course, most people don't do this. They sort of fall in love with one angle or another. Like, for example, there was a whole era of criticism in which people thought that, new criticism is the one thing. We want to pay attention to the art and only the art. But they were kind of, missing out on some things. They weren't looking at the whole picture. So what you want to do is when you read a poem or when you read a story, think, what would be a new critical perspective of this if I just look at the words? Okay, then think, what would the author's intent be? Maybe you can look back at what the author had to say about the story or the poem or the work of art and try to find out what they were really trying to accomplish in it. Then you can consider the context. Where was it written? What year was it written? What were the circumstances? What was the government like? What was the economy like? Was this person part of an oppressed minority group at the time, or were they in control? Okay, so you can consider those things. And then, of course, you can consider the reader response, your own personal interpretation of it. Even if that own personal response to it, maybe you read a story in which something happens to the character's mother, okay? And then you can take into account your own feelings of your own mother and how that relates to the story. But, of course, you don't want this to be the only thing, because then you're being kind of selfish. So, those are the four angles of interpretation or analysis. Really start to work on trying them out. Every time you read a new piece for this course, look at it. Try to look at it through each of the lenses and try to see if you can really test your interpretation.